Some of you may remember this. It was 40 years ago tomorrow, October 17th of 1973. And this is when the oil shock started. Now, what caused the oil shock? Well, the oil shock was when we came to the aid of the Israelis during the Yom Kippur War. And that meant that they had been invaded, essentially, by the Syrians and by the Egyptians. We backed them up. So what happened? OPEC decided that they were going to cut off oil supplies. And so all of a sudden you had gas line shortages. And we recognized something very unsettling in the United States. And that was that we had this dependency on foreign oil such that they could enforce their geopolitical will to some degree on us. They could cause actual pain. Now, that put in motion what you see here behind me, which is that over the course of decades, there was a revolution in energy. We've talked about it here at this table before. The United States became increasingly self-sufficient. The United States started producing more, and not just oil, producing more biofuels, producing more natural gas, everything across the board. But in the past few years, shale has brought us to a point where we didn't even realize we could be here. Enormous increases to where today the U.S. is now number one. That's right, number one in producing energy for the global market. You can see 12.1 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia is in the 2 spot, 11.8 million. Russia, number 3 spot, 10.5 million. So not only are we number one in that respect, we've also gone down in terms of our our share of the market. You can see here, oil has gone down over the course of time. Let's go to the next one you see here. Oil share of the global energy market has gone down because we've tried all these other things. The oil shock put in place policies, put in place market changes that all of a sudden increased the alternative. So we're not as dependent on the oil we would need from the Middle East. We can also see our production and consumption. See, the U.S. is kind of that blue one. We've been producing more, our economy, our population growing dramatically, and yet we're meeting more and more of those needs ourselves. We're getting closer and closer to energy independence. We're at a place now where we are producing a tremendous amount. Oil production is 50% greater today than it was during the oil shock in 1973. So we know that we're producing more energy. We know that we're more self-sufficient. Prices have been relatively stable for all of President Obama's time in office. But what about geopolitics? What about alliances, security, choke points? What about everything that comes into our minds when we look at the oil shock that aren't just our domestic economy? Go to the next. Show me what you see here are oil choke points, meaning places where if there were to be some kind of a disruption, it would have an impact on the marketplace. Now, these are less now than they were then because of what I talked to you about, because of the U.S. revolution in energy. You can see the Straits of Hormuz. You get a sense of the numbers here. You get a sense of where it's all coming from. Not a lot coming through the Panama Canal. Straits of Hormuz, very, very big. Straits of Malacca, very large. That's all going to China, basically, and the Japanese markets. So you can see that there has been something of a shift. But what we haven't seen yet, and what I want to talk to you today about, is how this affects the way we do business abroad with our allies, with our enemies, how it affects geopolitics specifically. We have not seen us throw around our weight, if you will, nor change our relationships, it seems, based upon the fact that we're now more energy sufficient than we've been at any time in the recent past. Joining us to work these things through is Dan Kish. He's a Senior Vice President for Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. Dan, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with a quote, if you will. It seems to me that people have thought that there would be the possibility of the U.S. using oil even as sort of a weapon. Now, Ed Morse, he's a global head of commodities research at Citigroup. He said that many people argue that with the coming of energy independence, the U.S. should adopt strong policies to enhance oil as an instrument of policy. But the greatest weapon in the U.S. policy arsenal is no weapon at all. It's to let markets work, buttressed by the growth in domestic and regional supply. That's the ultimate way to put an end to the old oil regime. What do you think about this? I mean, the U.S. has had this tremendous shift because, specifically more recently because of shale, in energy markets. Can we start to use this to throw our weight around? And should we start to use this to throw our weight around?
Well, what it really does, Buck, is increase our weight by producing more energy. And we still can't throw our weight around that much because we're still importing a significant amount of oil. It's just that the amount that we're producing has gone up. And honestly, in terms of throwing our weight around the world, the best thing that we can do is enhance our economy at home, reduce our deficit of our payment deficit that we've been pouring hundreds of billions of dollars abroad to buy oil from other people that we had right here at home and produce that much more. That does more than anything else. It also reduces the points at which we feel it necessary to intervene in the world if there are problems related to oil supply.
But Dan, that's where I wanted to go. It seems like we're not decoupling, if you will, from the Middle East, despite the fact, and as you point out, we're not actually independent yet, but you would think that as we increase our production here and therefore have a more secure supply, the old thinking was we won't have to be as concerned about what happens in the Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca. These won't be the geopolitical crash points, if you will, that they had been in the past. And yet we see we're still very much worried about what happens in the Straits. And is that just because we still import enough that it would really hurt us? I mean, can we ever get out of that old paradigm? Can we ever create enough here at home that we don't have to worry? Or is it just too integrated of a market?
Well, it's a very integrated market. And as long as the United States is the #1 economic power in the world, and we are sliding, but we remain the #1 economic power in the world, we're very concerned about the impact of oil, which is the most precious commodity for economic growth around the world, which is why the growing economies of China and India and other places around the world are using that much more, even as we're using less. Those are all part of the picture, just in the same way that if someone dealt with a commodity or tried to shut down the financial system worldwide, even though it might not affect us directly, it would certainly affect us. So clearly, we've got a role to play around the world in terms of oil, but in terms of what we can do to lessen our own load, the important thing to remember is that 40 years ago, when that oil was cut off, the government started involving itself in energy, and the picture is only of late turning around the other way. We've got the resources at home. The private sector is doing it. If the government gets out of the way, we can supply that much more of our energy. God gave us the resources. It's up, the government has been basically making a lot of decisions in between that were bad decisions, including those gas lines back in 1973. They were the result as much of price controls by President Nixon and the government as they were a 5% cutoff in oil supply, which is what the Arabs did.
That's a good point. I think the quote that you read is incredibly important, and what Dan just said about the government staying out of the way is incredibly important. The more that we produce, the more that we produce internally means the less we have to bring in. That affects prices globally, and as that pushes down prices and it puts pressure on OPEC. And their price-wise, that will reduce their global power. What would be problematic is if we begin to try and do what has been the problem for the past several decades is begin to interject politics into oil prices and into oil supply.
You want to look at politics, you put up that chart that Buck had that shows that 17 million, barrels a day traveling through the Straits of Hormuz. That's almost 40% of the world's oil supply, hitting that crash point right there. What is right there above the Straits of Hormuz? Iran. You want an answer for our policies towards Iran? There it is. I know we are allied with Israel, but don't fool yourself thinking that's not
even
a big
if we were 100% independent because of the effect on the market of shutting down the Strait. This is sort of, I think, what we're trying to get at. It's that the idea, the promise in the past had been that if we were independent, this stuff wouldn't matter. It's not that it wouldn't matter, it just doesn't matter maybe quite the same way that it does when we're importing 40% or 50%. I mean, you're narrowing the gap, but you're still tied to this.
Well, and I want to make this something than more about oil, because truthfully, the United States being energy independent is about more than oil. Dan mentioned that God gave us the resources sitting under us, but the truth is that this is more than about dead dinosaurs. It's about more than hydrocarbons under the United States surface, because we've known about, for example, shale gas and shale oil for quite some time. The key resource, the thing that God gave us, was innovation. The ability to innovate. It was to learn how to access that oil cheaply, and if we have a government that allows us to continue to innovate and innovate out of oil, innovate into the next source of fuel, that's our
U.S. total output, Will, in the past, since 2009, has swelled 3.2 million barrels per day since 2009, exactly because of what you're talking about, the U.S. innovation within that sector.
And let's note that that's in the face of what the Obama administration has tried to do.
That's what I was just about to say.
That's with them putting their hand on the
pressure down, and particularly in the Gulf.
And we talked about that last week, about how it's been private industry and on state lands that have allowed this innovation to boom. But it's also amazing to me how you look at this And yet the administration continues to kill the Keystone Pipeline. They will not build new refineries, no offshore drilling. Imagine if we actually explored those resources, where we would be, and the economic boom that would
But you're
be to this
asking an
country,
administration
jobs.
that really is an administration of apologies and appeasement of the United States to do something different, and I don't think that's going to happen.
Dan, just a one sentence answer from you. Is the Obama administration going to approve the Keystone Pipeline while President Obama's in office?
Great question. I don't know.
I'll give it to you.
All right.
How about this? It would if it was smart, because the Canadians are our #1 supplier of oil.
All right, Dan, we will take it, and thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.